We're all living through a deadly pandemic, and much, if not virtually all of the news on some nights is about that story and related developments. Our next story, which is very high in our broadcast because it's a huge story, has nothing to do with COVID, but it's something you need to know about. And it may involve your government, the Trump administration, using this time period to do something that it doesn't want everyone to scrutinize. The Justice Department is now formally pushing in court to try to extinguish, remove, and erase the entire prosecution of Michael Flynn. You may recall this was a key part of the Mueller probe. A U.S. attorney here serving in the Trump administration now says all of a sudden the entire prosecution, the entire case should be dropped against Trump's former national security advisor. But as you may recall, that is a very odd thing to do right now because that former security advisor, Michael Flynn, already pled guilty in court under oath to the crime of lying to the FBI and then tried to cooperate at one point in time later. After all this heat, after Mueller has effectively left the stage, now, later, Mr. Flynn had said maybe he wants to withdraw his guilty plea and see how that could work out. Well, the Justice Department, while acknowledging that Flynn pled guilty, is now breaking news, arguing he did so, quote, without full awareness of the very circumstances. And they assert that the government doesn't believe the Trump administration Justice Department could prove, quote, Mr. Flynn knowingly and willfully made a false statement. Now the government, sounding more like a defense counsel, is asserting in court that Mr. Flynn's false statement, quote, came from gaps in his memory. This decision was made public minutes after a prosecutor who worked for Bob Mueller, Brandon Van Grack, formally left, resigning this case. All of this comes on the heels of a very unusual thing when you have an independent investigation that touches on the president and the White House, which was a new attorney general, when he was instated, Bill Barr, wanted to review all of it and sort of put the Mueller prosecutors on trial. We may be seeing the fruits of this. It also revealed that a senior FBI official, in preparing for this interview, and we previously reported this, asked as part of the development of this investigative process, quote, what's our goal? Truth/admission, or to get him, Flynn, to lie so we can prosecute him or get him fired. A review urged Barr to drop the case. According to the Justice Department, the Attorney General is now saying not that this came from him or Trump, but that it sort of bubbled up, even though Donald Trump has publicly called for exactly this kind of softer treatment for the people who've gotten caught up in the probe that he is close with, like Roger Stone and Michael Flynn. Now, I want to remind you of something because we reported on this a lot. And we always try to be very careful and precise about it. The Mueller probe ended on a very careful legal middle ground. It didn't end in a witch hunt or an overreach where there was a trumped-up case against Donald Trump or an alleged conspiracy with Russia. Remember, and I reported this at the time if you were there along with us, Bob Mueller wrote a report, didn't find an indictable election conspiracy, didn't assert there was enough that could be criminally proven on what was colloquially known as collusion, and didn't indict on that. What he did find meticulously and carefully, this former Republican director of the FBI, who got that assignment to be special counsel, what Mueller did find was a kind of a crime spree at the highest levels of Trump world. And he charged those cases. And this is what you have to remember. I'm about to bring in a prosecutor who knows all about this, but I want you to remember this because it's such a big story right now. Every case Mueller brought, he won. No court, no jury, no defendant has ever defeated any of those cases. In other words, every time a prosecution did proceed, either it went to a jury trial and they convicted, or there was such overwhelming evidence that the defendants pled guilty, as we ultimately saw for Mr. Manafort, for Mr. Cohen, for Mr. Gates, and yes, for Mr. Flynn. He pled guilty. I want to remind you of that. A judge asked him in court, how do you plead? And Flynn said, guilty, Your Honor. The judge asked, are you entering this plea of guilty because you are guilty and for no other reason? Public, in court, under oath. And Flynn said under oath, yes, Your Honor. These are facts, public facts, under oath, provided to you by the adults involved. Tonight, we're seeing all of that attempted to be overturned by the Trump Justice Department, not because it wasn't proven in court, not because Mr. Flynn didn't admit guilt, not because Mr. Mueller didn't lay out a careful case, but because tonight we can report for you. After all that, the Justice Department is actively interfering with the results when they touch on individuals who are close to the president. Now, as promised, we turn to an expert in this, former federal prosecutor John Flannery, who has provided legal analysis for us throughout the duration of that Mueller probe, including how Mr. Barr handled it when he took over as Attorney General. I should note that Mr. Flannery has also served as counsel to congressional inquiries and has a great level of expertise on this. Good to see you. I hope you and your family are well. I haven't seen you in a little while, and thanks for being here tonight, sir.
It's good to be with you, Ari.
Let's start with the question, does this development look to you on the level?
No, it doesn't. It looks to me like the usual path that Barr follows. And in this case, he's enlisted Shea. And he's been having an investigation for some time of each of the special counsel's cases to see if he could find some way to slander and disrupt the participants to get rid of that case, or to at least make a path clearer for Trump, the president, for whom he's the consigliere, to pardon them. And I think this case is a good example of that. You have, on the one hand, the assistant special counsel withdrawing from the case, probably because he knew what was going to happen, that they were going to make a motion that he didn't agree to dismiss the pleas. And they tried to slander him by suggesting that there was some information he knew that when the court asked for it, he didn't give it. Well, Judge Sullivan may want to ask him about that.
Let's pause on that. You are saying, from your legal view, that you think there's enough evidence to suggest the Mueller prosecutor is leaving in protest, you think?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I think so, especially because he was an assistant special counsel and he had a focused assignment, if you will. He was looking into something, probably like me when I started. He cared about corruption, and that's what he was concerned about. And here you have a guy, Flynn, right after we have members of the president's family looking for a backdoor channel to communicate with the Soviets, with Russia rather. And then you have Flynn having exactly that conversation secretly toward the end of December. And he's talking about how don't worry so much about the ban that Obama wants to put in place. Don't worry about the fact that we're going to close down your embassy. So sort of be patient. And there was also a conversation about how to vote in the UN on a resolution involving Israel. So this was not a light affair. This was a significant affair, which has prompted people to talk to him as a traitor. And I think the investigators thought, as I would at the early part of the investigation, if I'm talking to Flynn, I want him to cooperate because this guy is my path to other people. He's had dinner with Putin in Russia. He's been going back and forth, and he's coming in a high-level position that involves national security. Right. This is a guy that shouldn't be in the White House to be talking.
Let's look at the evidence for the point you're making right now, which is this, in essence, is about Barr's approach versus Mueller's. And people have learned a lot about how Barr approaches this case, and he's spoken publicly, undermining the integrity of the investigation. And we know a lot about Mueller because I think people recall. We have written evidence that is newly released, John, about what Mueller's team was looking at and investigating with Flynn. I will read it for everyone. Allegations that Flynn may have, that is to say, they were investigating whether he committed crimes by, quote, engaging in conversations with Russian government officials, lying to the FBI, failing to report foreign contacts, and acting as an unregistered agent for the government of Turkey in a different scenario that has been also reported on. What does that, in your view, do to either supporting or not supporting this conviction, which, again, was a conviction that Flynn pled guilty to up until these developments?
It shows that it was a substantial case that should have gone forward. It shows that we were concerned about the highest kinds of security questions that this nation should be investigating. And it had the double perplexing dilemma of having people in the White House who may be involved in the very thing that Flynn was doing, because presumably he didn't do this on his own. So they were in a difficult position, the investigators, as to who to tell when. And the one person in the Justice Department who went over to talk about the concerns about Flynn got fired right after that, claiming it had to do with her not prosecuting certain kinds of cases or taking a position that the government wanted. But it was a coincidence to be concerned about. I think in the Barr administration, justice is a coincidence of the system, not a consequence of it.
The president is speaking out on this today. I want to play a brief excerpt for your response. I want to warn viewers what you are about to hear is legally false. Everyone is entitled to a defense, and we cover that carefully. But the president here makes a false claim alleging treason, which involves fighting against the government that's at war with a hostile foreign power, an active war. We can authoritatively say this is false. I want to warn people of that. Play this and get your response. This was the president today.
Sure.
He was an innocent man. He is a great gentleman. He was targeted by the Obama administration, and he was targeted in order to try and take down a president. It's treason. It's treason. So I'm very happy for General Flynn.
John?
I can't believe the bounds of law and responsibility that this man runs through every day he's in office, sometimes several times, lying about facts, lying about the law. If there was treason to be investigated here, it was to be concerned about Flynn violating policies of this country involving how to deal with Russia, how to deal with certain people who had committed crimes that we were concerned about, how we were concerned about them interfering in an election, and how we were concerned about this administration undermining a policy of the Obama administration having to do with that interference by closing down their embassies. So the president is, like usual, way off the truth, not even close, and way off the law, because he'll say anything. Slander, disruption are his method.
And it's very serious, because if this is meddling to help the president's allies, his friends, then you have now the execution of what the president's critics have said are one of the worst things about this administration, that, as they allege, there is overt public calls to investigate rivals. Hillary Clinton should go to jail. Oh, Joe Biden should be investigated. And then on the flip side, there is the alleged abuse of the Justice Department to go soft on, to protect, to have a sort of get out of jail free card, literally, for the president's allies. We can report tonight Chairman Nadler on the Judiciary Committee saying this is a corrupt abuse of power that they want to investigate. Having reported all that, as you know, as a legal reporter, I always want to give everyone all of the evidence to make up their own mind. There is one piece of the DOJ argument that could be meritorious if true, by which I mean what the president said is worthless. But the DOJ argues that if there are enough problems with the way Mr. Flynn was approached, then the misstatements he made, even if false, may not have been material, a key word that you know, and I think viewers who followed this case may remember, material, that if you make a false statement about nothing, you say, what did you have for breakfast? Eggs? No, I had cereal. That is immaterial, even if false. So this is, again, as I say, one thing that I wanted your view on, because it could be, if true, a defense. The DOJ saying new tonight, the government is no longer persuaded that Flynn's interview was conducted with a legitimate investigative basis, and therefore doesn't think Flynn's statements were material, even if untrue. So in fairness to all of this, that is a piece of a legal claim. Your response, sir?
Well, my response is that if you're lying about your contact with the ambassador from a foreign nation about ongoing policy that you disagree with, and discrediting that it'll be enforced, if that's not material in a national security investigation, I don't know what is.
Fair. I mean, you hit it on the head there, and that's why it does seem different than what you had for breakfast. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.